Hello and welcome to the podcast Ukrainian Studies at the University of Illinois. My name is Olga Khometa. I'm an assistant professor in Soviet and post-Soviet studies in the Department of Slavic Languages and Literatures at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, and I will be a host of today's podcast. And I would like to introduce our two fascinating guests today, Dr. Sophia Wilson and Maksym Butkevych. Maksym is a Ukrainian journalist, human rights defender, civil society activist, and officer of the Armed Ukraine's forces, and he was taken captive in June 2022 and spent over 2 years in Russian captivity in the occupied city of Luhansk as a prisoner of war. And now he speaks on behalf of those still imprisoned by Russia, for human rights for all, and on anti-imperial solidarity. Maksym also participated in all three revolutions that built and shaped Ukrainian democracy. Revolution on the Granite in 1990, Orange Revolution, as well as the Revolution of Dignity. And with this in mind, I think of you, Maksym, and your work as an epitome of Ukrainian democracy at its best. So it is a rare gift for us to have you with us today and to learn from your insights about Russian captivity, Russian violence machine, your work defending human rights on and off the battlefield, and the methods to build solidarity in Ukraine and beyond. And Dr. Sophia Wilson is an associate professor of political science at Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville, and the president of the American Association for Ukrainian Studies. Sophia's new book, Maidan, Ukraine's Democratic Revolution, will be released by McGill University Press in a few weeks in March. Her book is comparing three occupations of Ukraine by Nazi Germany, by Soviet occupation, and modern Russia. And I anticipate that your interview with Maksym today will perhaps approach this topic. And now I pass the microphone to you to lead this interview, and I will return with my own questions for Maksym at the end.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me here and giving this opportunity. It really is an honor to be able to talk to Maksym Butkevych. It really is a true honor. As was mentioned in the introduction so kindly, you went through a lot. And since being liberated, you tirelessly traveled all over the world to tell people about all the horrific experiences that you had to go through. And I imagine it is not easy to share this. Because it forces you to relive some of those horrors. I'm very grateful for you for being here, for educating us. Please feel free to dodge any questions and only answer the ones that you feel comfortable. Excuse me. We met 12 years ago as I was doing research on the Maidan Revolution. And in fact, as I was doing research about all the police brutality, abuses of human rights against the protesters under the Yanukovych administration, several journalists told me that, okay, if human rights is your thing, you must meet Maksym Butkevych. And that promise lived up to all the expectations because you helped me so much during my research. And in fact, now I measure other human rights activists to the high standard that you've set.
Thank you very much.
I wanted to ask you, since you devoted your whole conscious life to human rights activism, I wanted to start with asking you what motivated you to commit to that work.
Well, thank you very much for this opportunity and for being here, for this invitation. I can't really think of one specific reason why I became involved in human rights. I was in different various sorts of activism since my childhood. As has been mentioned before, I was participating in the revolution at Granite in 1990. I was a school kid at the time. But I believe that the very ideas of justice and the protest against hypocrisy, which was at the time at the very core of Soviet official ideology, was somehow very natural to me. Later on, I became involved as a student into social issues. I was part of Independent Student Union and issues of justice and solidarity were very dear for me. Actually, that was predominantly anarchist student unions. I'm of anarchist background in that resort. But I became more and more interested in trying to assist here and there people to know about their rights, what they can do. It was through civic engagement, through activism. And I didn't call it human rights activism at the time. I didn't probably know the term, or I didn't use it, but it was human rights activism already. When, for instance, we provided some sort of initial legal advice for those who participated in the protests, or when I tried to assist my friends who were following their beliefs and came under pressure from the state authorities. And later on, I became a journalist focusing on international news and current affairs. And among many other fields, I became really involved in issues of human rights related issues when it comes to migration, issues of asylum. Because I think, among other things, I, as an international news journalist, I understood pretty well what refugees actually are fleeing from, what kind of regimes are persecuting them due to their political views, religious affiliation, or belonging to certain group. And again, there was this feeling of terrible injustice which happened to these people. So I believe the notion of justice and solidarity as something that might enforce it was at the very core of my motivation at the time.
Mm-hmm. You know what's interesting? It's been so many years, right? We met in 2014, and then again we were talking in 2016. But there's something that absolutely didn't change as I was listening to you right now, is that you have the same aura of a very positive, amazing person. And I think it just radiates, and I think it comes with people who devote their whole life to helping others. And so it really is amazing to see you again and to see you being safe. Were there any, I'm curious, were there any people or historical figures that inspired you?
Well, I cannot think of anyone in particular as my role model, let's put it this way. But of course, those who stood up against injustice were always very interesting for me. Would that be people from short-lived Ukrainian independence at the beginning of 20th century, or people who fought for independence of Ukraine in mid-20th century, and then, of course, dissidents, Ukrainian dissidents who non-violently protested against human rights violations under the Soviet regime in 60s and 70s and 80s, and who went to jail serving long-term prison sentences just for what they said and for their insistence upon the dire need to observe human rights and their fight for civil liberties and freedom of expression, and rights for people to be free from fear of incarceration or pressure from the state authorities. So I believe that that generation, the generation of dissidents, influenced me at the very end of it a lot. I am fortunate enough to know in person some of these people, those who are still alive, some of them, And I'm very grateful for the opportunity to know them.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for sharing that. How about a little bit of a tough question? You, when through a decade after Maidan Revolution, before Maidan Revolution, you fought for refugees. You fought for their rights as they fled authoritarian regimes from Belarus, from Uzbekistan. You fought tirelessly for gay rights. At the same time, some people point out that Ukraine gained its independence from the Soviets relatively recently, in 1991. It became democracy in 2004. So why do you believe that the protection of the rights of minorities is absolutely necessary, even when a democratic nation is so young?
Well, I believe specifically when democratic nation is still young, it is a necessity because it paves the way to what this nation will look like in the future. And to me, it was very important to have this idea. Would it be in 90s when the situation in Ukraine was very different? And it was different also in terms of activism. It was time of dire economic hardships for many people. And a lot of people became disillusioned and felt passive and helpless in what they can and cannot do with their own lives. But especially in the dark times or in complicated times, to me it was important to treasure this ideal towards which we could strive to build a society where people can live freely in mutual respect, in respect towards each other's dignity and without fear. And it is not possible if there is even a rule of the majority, if the rights of the minorities are oppressed, because as long as someone is not free, as long as someone is oppressed, the whole community or a society built from different communities cannot be free. So to me it was very clear-cut. And I think that freedom as a key concept and very practical one, not something very abstract, was very important for me. Would that be in student years or later on? And I'm very glad that currently it is a value number one for so many Ukrainians, because this is what Ukrainians are fighting for. But freedom is possible. It's not possible to have freedom just for some part of population. No, it's partially free society is unfree society. It's not something that can be built for the majority, and while minorities are oppressed. So to me it was very obvious. Also because to me the notion of solidarity, crossing the boundaries between different communities, is vital. People supporting each other in different circumstances, and oppression of discriminated groups or minorities destroys the social fabric of solidarity. It just does not exist. And of course, it is a grave injustice. So,
yeah, very wisely put. Another thing, as I'm reading through Western accounts of what is happening, Russia-Ukrainian war, what is fascinating to note, or sad to note, that there is lack of realization that many of abuses were taking place even before 2022, right? With Russia annexing Crimea, with Russia de facto controlling regions in Donbass via paramilitary groups. And you back then also advocated for a number of people and for rights of political prisoners captured back then, as well as famously you organized campaign to support filmmaker Sentsov, who was in captivity by the Russian forces. What would you say are, if you can comment on that, the similarities and differences between those occupational periods, say if we look specifically Eastern Ukraine and those territories that were under occupation from 2014 to 2022, and after 2022 when it was solely the Russian forces that took control?
Yeah, currently Ukrainians, when they say the beginning of the war, they don't mean 2022, they mean 2014. So 2022 is the year of the Russian full-scale invasion or full-scale aggression, beginning of the genocidal war. But the war itself started in 2014 with the occupation of Crimea, as you rightly mentioned, and the war in the east of Ukraine. At the time, at least Russia pretended that it supports, of course, sides in this war, but it denied its direct involvement. Apart from Crimea, it was an attempt to shake Ukraine from inside, to produce more strives in Ukrainian society, to have pro-Russian political camps been active and probably at some point taking over Ukraine, leading it closer into Russian orbit and subjugating it to Russia. But they failed to do so. And this is what provoked the second stage, which is an open assault. And this is this was in 2022, the beginning of genocidal war. So basically this is where gloves were off and masks were taken off as well. Russia just openly said that it's going to destroy Ukraine. It could not do it from within. Solidarity of Ukrainian society turned out to be much stronger than they probably expected. So the only option they resorted to was brutal force. And even some people who kind of listened to Russian propaganda before 2022, who said that it's not that one-dimensional, that maybe we should make peace with Russia and try to live in some sort of cooperation before 2022. And they said that after 2022, the vast majority of them are, of course, of very different opinion. Russia is an aggressor state, and probably it's the first time when Ukraine doesn't have pro-Russian political camp in its current borders. And there is a joke, it is a sad, sarcastic joke in Ukraine that no one has done for de-Russification of Ukraine as much as Putin did with his all-out assault against Ukraine.
Yes, absolutely. And speaking about assault and beginning, it was 2022. What encouraged your decision in 2022 to volunteer and join the Ukrainian armed forces? Was it part of being a human rights activist, or was it in contrast to it?
It was part of it, part of the decision. There were a number of reasons. Actually, I think it goes from 2014 partially, because in 2014, after the beginning of the war, we were preoccupied for several years, primarily with assistance towards internally displaced persons in Ukraine. And by the winter of 2014-2015, I coordinated at the time a coalition of organizations helping IDPs, which was called Resource Center for Internally Displaced Persons. But I realized that I'm able to do my job, my work, my activities. It's not job, it's much more than that. Only because there are other people at the front line who, by fighting and defending us and defending me, are buying me time to do that. They actually give me this opportunity by fighting for me. So when the Russian full-scale invasion came in February of 2022, I thought to myself that I should be this time the person who helps my colleagues to do their human rights work by defending them at the front line. Also, of course, there were other reasons. There was very basic notion of myself being a Ukrainian. It is part of my identity, and I never wanted Ukraine to be subjugated by Russia or anyone else for that matter. And I felt it being my civic duty to join the defense. There was a situational reason. I was in Kiev at the time in my beautiful native city. And the battles raged on the outskirts of Kiev. So the choice was very simple. I had either to flee or to join the fight. And to flee to me was unbearable. And I realized that I have to defend my city and my loved ones who stayed in it. But of course, also there was this notion of being a human rights defender. And I'm talking about this currently from time to time, because I've been called a human rights defender for quite many years before that. And I knew that if Russia takes over, of course, one can forget about defending human rights in the occupied territories. I knew situation in Russia, human rights situation in Russia. I was in constant contact with my Russian colleagues. And also I dealt with refugees from Russia, those who had to flee persecution due to their political beliefs or their religious affiliations. And I knew pretty well, understood pretty well that human rights as a concept, as a notion, as a principle, as a value, have no meaning in the Russian world and in contemporary ideology of the Russian world. So human rights activism and defense, which were at the very core of my life for many years before that, would be rendered impossible. And as human rights community in Ukraine, I would say that in years of activism and struggle and advocacy and education and protest, we've achieved quite a lot. The situation with human rights in Ukraine is, of course, far from ideal. For human rights defenders, it's always far from ideal. But we've achieved quite a lot of things which would be impossible 20 years before that, for instance. And I knew that everything that, all of that would be just destroyed, wiped out if Russia takes over. So if I was called the human rights defender, I knew that I have to defend human rights with means available, and the only option available at the time was to take up arms and join the forces of defense of Ukraine, the armed forces. And this is what I've done. So paradoxically, I was never a military person, and I never dreamed about being a military. But paradoxically, because I was and still am a human rights activist, that motivated me to join fight against Russian aggression.
Mm-hmm. And as you're here and in the U.S. and other countries, you talk about your experience of being captured by the Russian forces and kept in captivity. Sometimes the interviews in their nature, they're too brief. Right, as I was listening, for example, to your interview with NPR, it talked about that you were sentenced for 13 years, and then it said that your case was appealed and denied.
Yes.
And that was sort of the end. And I understand, right, there was time limitation for the journalist who was interviewing you. But I kept thinking that it paradoxically, perhaps that wording, that brevity suggests that there was some kind of due process, right? That there was supposedly some kind of fair procedures and fairness of trial. But from your interviews, from your other interviews, some more detailed interviews that you gave to Ukrainian journalists and other prisoners of war, former prisoners of war who were liberated and came back to Ukraine, the picture, the reality is completely different. That there was nothing close ever to due process. So, if you don't mind, I wanted to take it step by step a little bit of this legal so-called process, but
Sure.
in fact, a judicial theater that Russians are putting up, and sometimes we wonder who are they putting that up to, right? Of course, the Russian people, for whom that propaganda it's very important, a very important part of Russia's state-society relations, but also in the West, right? It being summarized as appealed and denied,
Yeah.
right? So, How, maybe let's start with how and when you were informed of the nature of the accusations that Russian government had.
Yes, it's actually a very interesting point because on one hand, the overall procedure, the content of it, the substance of it were so absurd. And on the other hand, for some reason, it is, I believe, one of the features of contemporary Russian repressive machinery. They are really focused on procedure. So all the procedural steps should be taken with total disregard of substance. I was in captivity for 3 weeks. A bit less than a month. When I was for the very first time told that they are going to accuse me of war crimes and sentence me, convict me by the court, it was during one of the interrogations, and it came from an interrogator who played the bad interrogator. You know, there was a good interrogator and a bad interrogator. So that one was a bad one. He was angry at me because I just refused to give an interview to certain unnamed media where they wanted me to say things they wanted me to say, and I said that I don't want to do this, and I haven't lost touch with reality. I said, I understand that they can force me to do that, but it will be visible, and also they will have to do it. I will not do it on my own. I will not do it on my own will. And he became angry, and he said, for the first time, we are going to convict you for war crimes. And me, naively, I said, well, there is nothing to convict me for. I haven't done anything. And he responded, it's not a problem. It's not a problem at all. And then he continued with, you are all war criminals to us because you dared to resist us. It makes you war criminals. And I just took it as a hollow threat, to be honest, because still I had some illusions. We were already in captivity. We were denied everything. We didn't have anything. We didn't possess anything. Would that be, I don't know, proper food, hygienic items, or anything else? And we were held incommunicado, with no communication with the outside world. So I thought, why bother to, invent certain fabricated criminal case? But within a month's time, so it was a bit less than 3 months into captivity, I was taken to another interrogation by a special group of Russian investigatory committee. They were Russians, and they were from a military part of investigatory committee who were sent specifically to fabricate criminal cases against Ukrainian prisoners of war. That was a several hours long session with kind of forceful explanation to me what my options are, what happens if I don't cooperate with them, and basically the threats were that they either shoot me or more probably they will put me in conditions where I'll be broken down both physically and mentally. I would never be able to recover. Or they said I signed a confession and I'm convicted as a war criminal and then exchanged in 1 or 2 months' time. And since then, I knew that there is a criminal case, but I didn't know what I'm accused of, actually. I said that I'm not going to cooperate unless I'm the only person in the case. So I wanted not to be, given orders or receiving orders from anyone. I wanted to be the only one accused. And I also said that there should be no dead bodies in my case, that I didn't kill, presumably, anyone. They said it's okay. They actually had the case, which suit those requirements. But in full, I managed to read the substance of the case maybe in almost 6 months' time. And before that, it was totally unclear. I just had to sign forms. They didn't let me read what's written in there. They covered it with blank sheet of paper. And then they just stopped doing this. They said, sign quickly without reading. You'll read it later, they said. And when I read it for the first time, it was at the beginning of 2023, I was actually amazed by how badly it was fabricated. I stopped myself short from saying, why such a bad work? I would imagine things better. I would make it better. Of course, I didn't say that. But yes, that was when I learned what I'm accused of. And even from the materials of the case, it became clear to me, and I think to anyone who would read it properly, that it's all fabricated. But they didn't really care, because all the court decisions and everything, they were pre-written elsewhere. And the very court session, I remember asking one of the interrogators who said to me that there will be a court session within several weeks' time. I asked him, will there be a court, like a real court with a judge and the prosecutor and the lawyer? I was assigned lawyers of defense, actually, but I've never seen them. They never came to me, they never visited me, they never came to these so-called interrogations. They just filled the forms, whatever was demanded from them. And for the court session itself, they found a lawyer at last minute who's never seen me and who never read my case. But she came to the court hall wearing United Russia badge, shining, and asked the judge 15 minutes to familiarize herself with the case and with me. But yes, I was told, yes, there will be a lawyer, there will be a prosecutor and a judge. And I asked why? Why bother? I haven't met any single person who would believe that I did it. And they said, well, because it's a procedure. One should have a court because it's just the demand of the procedure. And I said, yes, but the procedure has to have certain meaning, certain sense. What's the point of this procedure? And they responded, the point of the procedure is that it is a procedure. So it has a point in itself. It doesn't have any additional meaning. I was wondering why, because when the court actually took place, apart from the prosecutor and the judge and the so-called defense lawyer, there were just guards. And them, and maybe a secretary of the court, they were the only ones who didn't really know what's going on. Everyone else understood everything. And there was no video recording of that court. There was no audio recording. So I was tempted at some point to stand up and say, listen, let's get over with it. We all understand what's going on. Just print out the verdict. But no, they played in front of each other as in some absurd theater. It was really a really absurd feeling, like I'm in some totally different dimension, with some, in the framework of some pervert system. I believe they use it for internal purposes, for propaganda purposes, of course. And later on, when it turned out that I had an actual real lawyer, a human rights lawyer in Moscow, who tried to get access to me, he was denied, and who lodged an appeal in my case. They organized an appeal with the courts of appeal and then the courts of cassation, but we knew pretty well, we didn't have any illusions that, the court would listen to it or something. It was just the wish to exhaust all the remedies, all the legal means available to us, although with the result predicted up front. Of course, no, it has nothing to do with real court. It has nothing to do with real justice. It is all absurd theater, really.
But there was the case, there was appeal, there was denial.
Yeah.
So they invest a lot in making it look real, but behind it, as you've spoken in other interviews, there was torture. right? And as you said right now, obvious fabrications, right? Because there were a number of reports written as this was happening, and Amnesty International wrote about your case, talking how obvious the fabrications were. You were not even in the town where the alleged crimes were committed, supposedly by you, right? So it was obvious, and yet the show kept going.
Yeah, exactly. And later on, of course, I tried, as everyone did, I tried to find at least some logic in it. Mm-hmm. So the initial guess from my co-inmates, other POWs, was that I was selected because I was known to them as a journalist and a human rights defender. They probably didn't understand what human rights defender means. And they don't really understand what the journalist means, because to them, journalist and propagandist are the same thing. Journalist is propagandist. So I was enemy propagandist. But I was someone known to them. And this is why they selected me for this sham trial. But later on, I met other Ukrainian POWs convicted on fabricated cases. Almost all of them are convicted on fabricated cases, those whom I was held with in the next more than a year. And they are people of very different walks of life, and they were not publicly known before that. So it looked like they tried to fill certain quota of Ukrainian war criminals, maybe because they talked about Ukrainian war criminals on their propaganda for such a long time, they needed to show some of them. There was then another thing. Almost all of us, we were accused of similar things. And when I read court decisions, not only in my case, but in the cases of several other POWs, to me, an overall logic of this assembly line of fabricated cases became more or less obvious. When Russian army surrounded or tried to take over a certain village or town, at the time it was 2022, they primarily tried to erase it with their artillery. They bombarded it heavily with cannons and mortars. And then when they took it over, they found civilians injured by their own fire. And they put a blame upon Ukrainian POWs. They said, we had a case of one POW who was convicted for throwing a hand grenade at the group of civilians on 200 meters distance. So of course we had a joke: "What are you doing here? You should be at Olympics now." Then we had other absurd cases, totally absurd, but all these civilians, at least most of them, were real. And they were injured by blasts, and these blasts came from Russian artillery. But then it was kind of to deliver themselves from responsibility and also to switch the blame to Ukrainian POWs. Although to me it is still partly a mystery why they went. I understand the implementers of these decisions, the executors. Every successful fabricated case produced a career opportunity for them. So they were interested personally, but those at the very top who sanctioned all this operation, and I'm sure it was sanctioned at the very top, what was their incentive? Apart from using propaganda purposes, I don't know. At some point we were told that we are going to be exchanged for Russian soldiers convicted in Ukraine for war crimes, but it never became the case. So I don't know if it was true or false. Otherwise, yeah, to me it's still partly a mystery.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for sharing this. It is so important to hear for all of us of what's actually happening there behind this this smoke of war, right? This fog of war, right? One of the In some of your discussions, you told that with the horrible conditions that were in captivity, and including torture, including constant fear as prisoners of war, Ukrainian prisoners of war never knew what was coming. And you spoke of stories that you were trying to write. Of course, there was nothing to write with, though you wrote them in your mind, and you shared them with your inmates. And it says so much about your bravery, and how you kept taking care of other people even as you were in captivity. And I was wondering, the characters that I'm sure in your story, those characters met certain challenges. So what, in your fictitious stories, what gave them hope?
It was in one of the cells when it was my mental practice to compose texts, and other guys in the cell, they were bored. Boredom is a terrible thing. We were never taken out for walks even, so we actually had to spend months and months in the cells with no communication with the outside world, and I wanted to entertain them. And also, these were actually initial months of captivity, so we were hungry, and it was difficult to sleep at night, so I composed a story in my head which was satirical. It was satirical and dystopian. In some parallel dimension or in some distant future. Of course, it was satirical about Russia as well, about Russian pseudo-empire. And when I next day told this story to my co-inmates, they demanded what happened next. They demanded me to compose next stories. So there were different characters in each story. It was the same reel, but with some time I started to I think try to highlight some philosophical questions in those stories, and issues of life and death and freedom. I think humanity and freedom and human solidarity especially is something that really gave hope to those characters in those stories who really wanted, who needed certain values. Not all of them actually needed them. Some of them were dark characters or totally obedient to the regime, but there were others, and the willing to build together better future for humanity, for community, for people around. So that was something that gave hope, and I would say that it probably reflected what I had in mind at the time, because I put all my trust and all my hope in other people, in my colleagues, in my friends, in my loved ones, that they remember me, that they don't forget about me, that they fight for my release. And it kept me going big time. Yeah, it helped me a lot.
How beautiful and inspiring. Thank you. Fascinating. Thank you so much for sharing. And just my last words is I wanted to remind you that while you were taking care of other people for so many years, even in captivity, and please remember to take care of yourself.
Thank you.
Please allow yourself time to rest, to spend time with your loved ones.
That's not easy at the moment, yes, with so many international trips, but it's needed. It's needed. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Maksym.
Thank you for this discussion, this interview, and very insightful questions, and your sharing your knowledge and insights. I see this certain way of Russians handling prisoners of war in the ongoing Russo-Ukrainian war reminds me of a tradition of how the Soviet how Ukraine's civilians were treated under Soviet occupation. And I'm thinking of Spilka Vyzvolenia України, the Union of Liberation of Ukraine, when almost 30,000 Ukrainian intellectuals and cultural elite were sentenced for on the basis of similarly fabricated cases. So there is a lineage between modern Russia's judicial theater and the Soviet way of performing similar actions in handling the occupied lands and peoples. And I'm also thinking about Stanislav Aseyev's torture camp on Paradise Street, another account of a POW, he was a civilian in Russian captivity in Donetsk, kept in this torture camp in a prison isolation. And his book details about what the prisoners were facing and had to endure. And you can compare this with Ivan Bahryany, Sad Getsemansky, which tells us a very similar account of how Soviets treated Ukraine's prisoners in the 1930s during Stalin's purges. It's like the similarity of methods is striking. So perhaps my question would be to like both of you and maybe even Sophia, first of all, about this Russia's inheritance of the Soviet practices of occupation, and what more does it tell us?
Fascinating question, right? And so as you introduced my current research, so I compare Nazi occupation of Ukraine as example of fascism, Soviet occupation of Ukraine as example of so-called communism, right, or Leninism more specifically. Not fascism, but now as we look at Russia's political ideology, it's much more similar to the Nazi Germany as it places emphasis on imperialism. And I absolutely agree with Maksym Butkevych here that it is very much a genocidal war, and it's in its blatant claim that they want to destroy Ukraine, they want to wipe Ukraine off of the map of the world, so the similarity there, and for fascist ideology that builds its on Mussolini's thought, is that imperialism and conquest and atrocities are the aim. So imperialism is its own goal. For Soviets, imperialism was one of the tools, and political ideology was supposed claim of some sort of impossible eventual communism, but in order they justified totalitarian regime that had very similar tactics and strategies that fascist regimes did. What Soviets did is because they didn't present danger to the rest of the world the way Nazi Germany did, they focused on the on the territories of the Soviet Union, and after those tactics of 1920s and the 1930s, after Western Ukraine was taking over, and all the same tactics. And then, of course, in Holodomor in the 1930s, Ukraine, where millions of people were starved to death, and then more and more propaganda, they succeeded essentially at killing millions who were fighting against and weakening any other chances of resistance, and then convincing those who stayed alive and those children, all the consequent generations, that this totalitarian regime was for their own good. So.
Yeah, and thank you very much for this question also, because it has personal deep meaning to me, because I said elsewhere, this initial several hours forced interrogation when I was informed that there is a criminal case and I should cooperate, etc. When I was brought back to my cell after it, one of the first persons I thought about was my great-grandfather, who was killed in 1938 as the enemy of the people. and he was accused of being a member of counter-revolutionary underground pro-Ukrainian independence network. I believe his case, as well as many others, and he was a peasant. He was not from intelligentsia, but there were so many people who perished in 1937, and especially 1938, in Ukrainian countryside, being accused of being part of either Union for Liberation of Ukraine or similar networks and organizations. And I thought about him when I was brought back to my cell, because at some point in time I had an access to his file in archives of Service of Security of Ukraine, and I read the protocol of his interrogation when he was asked, when did you join this underground counter-revolutionary organization? And he responded, I don't know what you are talking about. I have no idea. And then the next question was, we know that you are lying. You should tell us when and how you became involved and who involved you. And suddenly, in totally different tone, according to the protocol, he responds, yes, I acknowledge that I was lying and I was involved in underground counter-revolutionary organization, this and that way. And I knew pretty well what happened between his first answer and the next question. So to me, it was a feeling that this repressive machine, which committed Stalin's Great Terror in 30s, and later on KGB machine in Soviet Union, it didn't go anywhere, actually. It still exists. And of course, in his worst nightmares, I presume my great-grandfather would be able to think that more than 80 years later, his great-grandson in other region of Ukraine will also have to confess to something he hasn't done. Okay, not been killed, but been sentenced to long-term imprisonment in the framework of the same repressive machinery. It was on retreat for some time, but then it came back, and it came back with the occupation. So to me, it is really one of the important points about Ukrainian resistance to Russian aggression and occupation is that it's not only that Ukraine should preserve its independence and integrity and its values and worldview, but it should stop that machinery, and it should be ultimately destroyed, because if not, the next generations will also run risk at some point to find themselves in situations where they will have to confess to something they've never done and to be punished for that. So to me, it's the same machine, basically.
Thank you. Thank you for your answer. I think we need to finish here. Perhaps the last question I have for you. How do you, Maksym, see your place and role in Ukraine's society as it is now through the ongoing war, your role for Ukraine's victory, and how do you see yourself now fit in pursuing the goals you had like before as your labor of love, as your life goals?
Well, that's not an easy question, of course. I remain human rights defender. Human rights are even more valuable to me than they were before. Sometimes I am asked if I'm not disillusioned with human rights activism and human rights institutions, because I'm told when you were in captivity, they didn't help you. Neither these institutions nor the very notion of human rights. But to me it is important, when you are in the place where human rights have no value, you realize how important they are. And but they are something that is not taken for granted. They are something should not be taken for granted. They should be treasured, they should be preserved, and they should be defended. And we have, and I'm afraid we will have, for many years after the end of the war, a lot of human rights work. Also, I understand that it is by collective efforts of many people, not only in Ukraine, and certain chance that I am free now and I'm able to speak to you, while most of people whom I spent my time with in captivity, they are still there. But so I feel like there is an obligation on my side to talk about them and to remind that there are a lot of Ukrainians, both prisoners of war, military and civilian detainees, who are still in Russian detention under bad conditions, being either held without trial or be convicted on fabricated charges. And I should speak about them. This is my duty of sorts. So this is what I primarily nowadays focus on. But of course, I'm going back to human rights activism. And I'm afraid we'll have a lot of work to do. We'll have to reconstruct the country, and we'll have to shape our common future together according to our beliefs and our values, according to our worldview, which is in such a stark contrast with the ideology of the Russian world, where in our view, human being is the value number one. So we should keep it, and we should try to do everything not to lose our main things from our side in the fog of war. So I'm going to try to contribute to that.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for doing your work. I wish you best of luck in achieving your goals. Thank you, Maksym. Thank you, Sophia. That was a wonderful conversation. And I would like to finish here and looking forward to more podcasts and meetings with fascinating guests speaking on Ukraine-related topics.